Entire villages were wiped out as millions of Ukrainians died in the early 1930s in what's come to be known as the Holodomor. Translated, it means starved to death, which only begins to tell the horror of what happened under Joseph Stalin's forced agricultural collectivization. Washington Post columnist and Pulitzer Prize-winning author Anne Applebaum has scoured the records kept under lock and key until the fall of the Soviet Union and lays out the full extent of the tragedy in her new book. It's called Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine. It was the winner of this year's Lionel Gelber Prize for Best Book on Foreign Affairs. And with her other books, Gulag and Iron Curtain, it is now the third volume on Soviet-era atrocities that she has written. And Anne Applebaum joins us now. Very good to have you back in that chair.
Thank you very much.
We are going to spend some time tonight on this program on what is one of truly the most horrific chapters in human history. So let's set the scene. It is spring, summer 1933. If you were visiting, traveling through Ukraine at that time, what would you have seen?
By the spring and summer of 1933, most of the villages in some parts of Ukraine would have had most of the food removed from them. In other words, teams of activists had gone from house to house and taken everything: grain, potatoes, vegetables, cows, whatever livestock anybody had, whatever.
On Stalin's orders.
On Stalin's orders, on the orders of the party. They would have removed all of the food. They then blocked the roads. They blocked the roads of the Republic of Ukraine, and they tried to prevent peasants from going from the countryside to the city. And so what you would have seen, and that was in the autumn, winter of 1932-33. And so by the spring and summer, you would have seen scenes of real devastation. You would have seen whole villages that were completely empty. You would have seen possibly dead people lying on the streets or in the train stations. You would have seen piles of bodies unburied because there was really nobody to bury them. You would have seen mass graves in places where people had managed to bury them but didn't have the energy to do anything else. You would have seen fields that were untended. By that time, they were bringing in students and other people from outside the Republic to bring in the harvest because there was nobody else to do it. You would have seen institutions completely disorganized. The church was not functioning. Many churches had been destroyed or had their bells taken down. Many priests had been sent away. The whole fabric of what had been the Ukrainian countryside was destroyed.
It's a failed state, essentially. Nothing's working.
Nothing would have been working. Nothing would have been happening the way it was supposed to. And people were starving or had already starved.
We pointed out in the intro that you are certainly no stranger to trying to document Soviet atrocities. But I wonder whether even you were shocked by what you uncovered as you looked at the records that had never before been seen.
So what's really awful about this story, and is a little bit different, as you say, even from the previous books I'd written, is that there's nobody who kept a memoir or who wrote about it in a way that is in any way uplifting. You don't find, as you do with people who are in the Gulag, that they came to some understanding about themselves or about humanity or the human will to survive. It's really a story of semi-literate peasants dying of starvation. And what happens to human beings when they die of starvation is very unedifying. Honest people become thieves. They become murderers. They are willing to steal from their neighbors. Some of them even become cannibals. People literally go insane with hunger. And it's very, very unattractive. People lose their humanity. Actually, unattractive is the wrong word. I mean, it's horrifying almost beyond belief. I found it a really difficult book to write. That's not, of course, the only topic in the book, but that's probably, I suppose, the culminating chapter.
You found it hard to write. I tell you, I found it hard to read because there are images in that book that I know are going to stay with me for as long as I've got my marbles. And one of which was, I was telling you just before we started, a mother who has obviously gone insane from hunger, chasing after her children with a knife to kill them. There were plenty of so-called Sophies Choice moments, right, that families had to go through. Which children do I kill in order that others would live? Do I kill my children or my husband? I mean, when you saw that kind of stuff, when you read about that kind of stuff, how does one react to that?
It's really difficult. I mean, the only way I was able to deal with it and working on it was think, well, at least by organizing this, by telling it in a coherent way, by making it part of his story, then I somehow make it accessible to people so that other people can understand it. But no, I won't hide it. It was very difficult, to read. I mean, if you're at all a gloomy person, there are ways in which, you read it and you can at least say, well, aren't we lucky? Isn't our society stable? Haven't we achieved something since then? And you can try and learn lessons from it that way. But otherwise, you're right, it's very difficult.
Is there a consensus as to how many people perished because of this forced famine?
There isn't exactly a consensus, but there are kind of better and worse numbers. I use the numbers that were put together by a group of Ukrainian demographers who went back through all kinds of archives, local archives, and put together lists of people who, anyway, they made an estimate based on how many people should there have been and how many people there were actually. Because, of course, as you know, if you read the book, a lot of the statistics were subsequently falsified. So it's been difficult to go back and use those.
Well, the census.
The census.
They faked the census.
The census was actually faked, yes. But the team that did that, they came up with a number of 3.9 million people who had died unnaturally. In other words, those are the number of people who died over the number whom you would expect to die in those years.
I think what was new to me was the information that Stalin sent his henchmen to people's farms to steal their food. I wasn't aware of that part of the story. The conventional wisdom has always been all of these people died because the Kremlin forced collectivization on all of the farms. And I think we should just take a moment and explain what that entailed. Can you help us with that?
Yes, it's very important to understand. That, I think, is the main achievement. That's the main thing that the archives have taught us that we didn't know previously, because for many years people knew that there had been starvation in the Soviet Union after collectivization. And I should say there was a lot of starvation in Russia, in other Soviet republics. In Kazakhstan, there was a terrible famine that had other causes as well. But the specific nature of the Ukrainian famine, why it was a little bit different, was due to a series of decisions that were taken, as I said, in the autumn of 1932. And that led to these teams of activists going into villages and taking food. So this wasn't a famine that was caused by bad politics. It was literally the confiscation of food and then shutting off the roads so that people couldn't escape. And that's a little bit different from how we've been accustomed to thinking about it in the past.
The collectivization of the farming system in Ukraine entailed what?
Well, collectivization, which took place all over the Soviet Union, entailed telling the peasants that their land was no longer their own, confiscating it, sometimes confiscating tractors, farm machinery, horses, cows, whatever they owned, sometimes houses, and taking all private enterprise and all private farming and putting it in the hands of the state.
To what end?
The end was to make farming more efficient. It was to be efficient, and also the end was to proletarianize the peasantry, to make them more easily controlled, to make them into a class of people that was dependent on the state, so they wouldn't be independent. Stalin was very afraid of peasant uprisings and of peasants who would defy the Soviet system, and he was particularly afraid of them in Ukraine, where there was actually an enormous amount of resistance to collectivization. There were literally armed rebellions. There were people who went into their barns and found weapons left over from the Civil War and attacked the police and attacked the army in order to save their land, to save their property during collectivization. And this was something Stalin feared again. And that was the purpose of collectivization, was to exert more control over that part of the country.
The one thing that, well, many things surprised me, but certainly one of the things early in the book that surprised me was the sort of classic play out of the Soviet playbook is, we take any particular ethnic nationalism out of your lives, we sort of force everybody to dance around this notion of the Soviet man and woman. But that wasn't the case in the beginning with Ukraine, right? They allowed the Ukrainian language to stand, they allowed people to have their original traditions. That seems very off-brand for the Soviet Union. Why did they allow that?
There was actually, the pattern wasn't quite as we remember it. This was not just me documenting this, others have noted this. There was actually, in the 1920s, there was a moment when, as a result of the Civil War, in which there had been a big Ukrainian uprising and the Ukrainian national movement had played a big part and had fought against the Bolsheviks decided that it was better not to fight that and better to create a kind of Ukrainian national state within the Soviet Union and to promote the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture and theater and so on. And that was all done in the 1920s. But towards the end of the 1920s, Stalin began to fear that that had gone too far. And he worried that this Ukrainian national movement was too challenging for the Soviet state. And so that was the part of the reasoning behind the famine, and that was part of the reasoning behind the assault on Ukrainian intellectuals that took place right after the famine, and of course these two things are connected.
The subtitle of the book, of course, is Stalin's War on Ukraine, and I wonder if there was something particular about the way he handled Ukraine that would have been different from all the other Soviet republics he dealt with.
So Stalin fought nationalism and independence movements and anti-Bolshevik movements, as he interpreted them, wherever they were. I think that probably the only difference in Ukraine was that Ukraine was the biggest non-Russian republic. It had borders with Western countries. It was where the national movement was particularly strong. And so the efforts to destroy it and undermine it went particularly far and deep in Ukraine.
How was it? I mean, if the idea was to impose through collectivization, a kind of new efficiency on agriculture in the broader Soviet Union, how was it of benefit to Stalin or the Soviet Union to have millions of people starving to death?
Clearly, it was not of benefit. Clearly it was not an economic, you can't look at it with an economic rationale.
So why didn't they reverse course?
The benefit, well, they did eventually reverse course, but the benefit to Stalin was political, not economic. The benefit was you got rid of the most prosperous peasants, the ones who were most likely to be anti-Soviet. In Ukraine, you got rid of what he thought of as the kind of base of the Ukrainian national movement, which was in the peasantry. You got rid of a possible resistance movement. You got rid of an independent class of people. And that, to Stalin, was a benefit.
He says at one point, if memory serves, to a colleague of his, "I fear we are losing Ukraine." If they had, what would the historical implications of that have been?
Stalin was always afraid that an uprising in Ukraine or rebellion in Ukraine would have an effect on the whole Soviet Union, because it very nearly did in 1918. And the book is, when I first started writing it, I thought, well, this is a book about 1931 to 1933, 3 years, not so difficult. And then actually, as I began reading into the subject, I realized that you had to go back much further. And the book actually begins in 1917 with the Ukrainian Revolution, which took place at the same time as the Russian Revolution, not quite so well known. And Stalin was really, from that moment, always worried about a challenge from Ukraine, an anti-Soviet movement from Ukraine. And he was worried about Ukraine breaking off, becoming independent, having challenging somehow Bolshevik rule. And that, of course, would have had economic consequences, but also political consequences. As I said, Ukraine was big. It had a border with Poland. It was a country that could have, if it had gone the other way and become an independent state like Poland or like Czechoslovakia or like Hungary or the Baltic states in the interwar period, it would have been an anti-Soviet state, and that was what he was worried about. Stalin's
wife killed herself. Was it at this time that she killed herself?
Stalin's wife killed herself in the autumn of 1932, which is exactly when collectivization was becoming clear that it wasn't working, it was going badly.
Is that why she did it?
So at the time, that was the rumor, and that was what people said, and that was what people said afterwards, that the failures of Bolshevism and the mass death and also the increase in repression was the reason why she killed herself, that it was disappointment or it was anger at Stalin. Of course, we don't know that. She may have been depressive. There are lots of reasons why people kill themselves sure. And so on. But certainly that was said at the time, it was said afterwards. And it's thought to have been one of the things that destabilized Stalin that autumn. And it's thought to also have been one of the things that made him kind of double down on collectivization. No, he was not going to admit that it was a mistake or a disaster. There was also, at that time, quite a lot of ferment inside the party, inside the Bolshevik party, people objecting to collectivization, angry that it was happening in the way that it was. And he took that moment, instead of stepping back, as he could have done, he instead pushed forward and launched this attack on Ukraine.
All told, how long did the famine last?
If you count it from, the statistics usually go from 1931 to 1934 because people began starving in 1931, and you still have evidence of starvation in 34. But the height of it, the most intense period, is these confiscations of food that begin in the autumn of winter in 1932, and the spike in death rates that begins in the spring of 33.
It is referred to as the Holodomor. And, if you go to the Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg, there is a a massive, I guess, installation dealing with this moment in history. But I wonder if you can help us with the etymology of that word, because that word does encompass two different notions, right? What does it mean?
So Holodomor, I mean, it's actually quite simple. It's a Ukrainian phrase, and mor comes from the word for death, and holod, the word for hunger. So the word means death by hunger. And there's an implication of terror by hunger. So, or deliberate death, rather, murder by hunger. So the word means, you can translate it as terror famine or death famine, with the implication that it was caused or had a source.
In the midst of all this, Russia is exporting food to other countries. Did they know this in Ukraine?
Yes, well, some people knew it. There were people working on the ships in Odessa who saw food being exported.
And I mean, just as a historian, how offensive is that?
Well, that's part of why Ukrainians have always felt that it was a deliberate famine. In other words, for many years, and I'm sure we'll get to this, the famine was denied, it was covered up, it wasn't allowed to be discussed at all. And in more recently, in the last couple of decades, as evidence has come out that there was a famine not only in Ukraine but in Russia, a lot of Russian historians have tried to say, well, there was a famine, but it was accidental, And the inside Ukraine, there has always been a memory. There have been a number of things put together that led people to believe that it was not an accident, and one of them was this export of food. I mean, if you're doing everything you can to save people from starvation, why are you exporting?
Let's just take a pause from the text for a moment, and I want to read something. This was posted online in response to a Timothy Snyder review of your book in the Washington Post. While the famine of 1932-33 did take place, it was not exclusive to Ukraine, and it was not of Russia's making. It was a direct result of the policies of communists of all nationalities, not least of Ukrainian communists, against all affluent peasants, not least Russian ones, all of whom the communists saw as small capitalists and thus enemies of the working class. Same policies have been applied throughout the USSR, and every agriculturally rich region of USSR suffered the same fate. So says Andrei Kuleshov. To which you say what?
So I don't completely disagree. He's right that the collectivization policies were directed at the whole country. He's right that there were deaths of starvation in Russia. I explain that in the book as well. I also agree that this was not a Russian assault on Ukraine in that sense, that it was a Soviet assault on Ukraine. And there were absolutely Ukrainians who collaborated, both they were in the activist groups, there were Ukrainian communists who collaborated at the time. There's no doubt in my mind about that. The only exception I would make is that there is now, if you read the archival record and if you put that together with what we know about what happened on the ground, it's pretty clear that there were some special policies and tactics in Ukraine. And that they were the result of a set of decisions taken in the autumn of 1932. And you can trace it exactly. You have this series of decisions in the Politburo, then you have the activist, the expropriation of food, and then you have this spike in death rates, followed immediately by an assault on the Ukrainian intellectuals and actually even the Ukrainian Communist Party. So it's almost like you can speak generally about Hitler's crimes, and that includes attacks on the gypsies or on the on the people of Poland. And then within the broad category of Hitler's crimes, you can also talk about the Holocaust. And I would argue that you can see this famine in the same way. There's a broad category of the Soviet famine. And then within that, there is a special set of circumstances in Ukraine, which you can call the Holodomor. So I don't completely disagree with the statement, but I think it's missing this piece. And usually that piece is missing because people don't know that story. And that was one of the reasons I wrote the book, was to make it clear.
I wasn't going to go here, but since you brought up the Holocaust, let's do this. And I always want to tread very carefully when comparing massive tragedies like this. But I am interested in your view on this. Is the Holodomor as much of a genocide as the Holocaust was?
So if you define genocide as an attack on a nation as a nation, and an attempt, if not to destroy everybody, then to destroy the many people and the national culture and so on, then yes, the Holodomor is a genocide. And I'm very happy for it to be classified as that. I'm not going to go down the road of comparing different genocides and talking about which is worse and which is better. I don't think it's very useful. I think we can learn things by talking about them in the same context, because there are ways, of course, in which they're different and similar, and you can learn things about that, but it's not useful to have a competition.
But they were both systematic exterminations of a people.
Yes, they're different. They're conducted differently. They have different purposes. But yes, they are systematic. They are the state destroying a set of people for political reasons. Yes.
Okay, one more on this, because if you make the comparisons, Germany has done quite a job trying to atone for the sins of the Holocaust. Has any Soviet or Russian leader ever apologized or even acknowledged what's in this book?
No, they haven't, and it's a very good point. The Soviet Union never spoke about it, repressed people who tried to speak about it, as we've said, repressed even the statistics so that it could never be properly studied. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian state has never acknowledged this, spoken about it, and indeed has also pushed back against Ukrainians in particular who try to speak about it. So there has been not just not acknowledging it, I think something more than that. There has been a contrary effort to repress the story, deny it, not tell it, make sure that it isn't known. And I think that's part of a more general Russian national interest in denying Ukraine any kind of separate history or any kind of separate role, even in the Soviet Union.
You do refer to one thing in the book, though, that might be an exception to that. I think I remember a story about Dmitry Medvedev, Putin's, I think, prime minister at the time, or maybe he was president, can't remember, did go to a ceremony in Ukraine about this, did he not?
He did eventually go to one ceremony in Ukraine when Yanukovych was president. And Yanukovych had kind of dialed back some of the conversation about the Holodomor, had kind of lowered it as a topic in his speeches. And
because he was a Russian stooge.
He was. I mean, that's one way to put it. But yes, he was considered to be a pro-Russian president, and so it may be that Medvedev went there for that reason.
Okay, I want to come back now to what you were talking about earlier a few moments ago, which was this notion about what the world knew and what the world didn't know, because there was a kind of omerta about this whole story for many, many years. So let's start with back then. Did the world outside of the Soviet Union at the time know that this was happening?
It's a very difficult question. What do you mean by know? Who knew? Some people knew. People just across the border knew in Poland. Priests knew. Some diplomats knew.
Did the President of the United States know?
Probably not. Probably the President of the United States didn't know. Had he really wanted to know, he could have found out. But the way that knowledge moves. So some people knew, but they didn't persuade other people that it was important. So there was famously one journalist who knew.
Walter Duranty.
Well,
is that the one you're referring to?
I was referring to Gareth Jones.
Oh,
there was a Welsh journalist, very young Welsh journalist, who actually went through Ukraine exactly at the moment we began this conversation with, in the spring of 1933. Saw starvation, came out, spoke about it, and wrote about it. But he was not a famous journalist. He was not a well-known person. And his reports were immediately downplayed and dismissed by the most famous journalist of his generation, Walter Duranty, who was the New York Times correspondent in Moscow. And so Duranty's decision that he didn't want to talk about this for a series of reasons meant that it didn't gain wider knowledge. It wasn't on the front page of the New York Times. It was on, in smaller, less influential places and papers.
I have to know more about that. Why would it have been in Walter Duranty's interest to downplay one of the biggest catastrophes in world history if he's got a front row seat to it?
It's a very interesting story. So first of all, for any journalist based in Moscow at that time, it was impossible to do any honest reporting. Or you could up to a point. There were things you weren't allowed to say because all your information went out via telex, and that was censored, and you were only allowed to remain in Moscow at the pleasure of the regime. And so people were very careful in what they said. And by the way, that was true of Soviet reporting right up until the very end. There were things you could and couldn't write. Duranty seems to have had, in addition to that, an interest in quashing this story. He did tell a British diplomat that he knew there was a famine, and that he even spoke of 10 million people dying all over the Soviet Union. My guess is that his previous reporting, in fact, the reporting he won the Pulitzer Prize for, included a very lavish praise of collectivization and what a great success it was. And so it may have been that he didn't like the idea of his reporting being undermined by this story of famine. There are others who've always thought he was somehow bought, or because he was living so comfortably in Moscow, and there were many other reasons why this was the case. I suspect vanity was really the main explanation.
So Donald Trump didn't invent the notion of fake news coming out of the New York Times. It happened 85 years ago.
I'm afraid it did, although there have been other New York Times reporters since then who've redeemed it.
Yes, I would agree with that. Okay, now moving the story along then, beyond the censorship of the time, there was kind of a hush, an acknowledged hush about this. One didn't speak of it. Even after Khrushchev opened things up in the 50s, one still didn't speak of it. Why not?
It was a taboo subject. It was something that the Soviet regime didn't want to have happened. As you say, Khrushchev gave his famous secret speech after Stalin died. He told people what he revealed in public for the first time, or admitted in public rather, that terrible things had happened, but he'd never mentioned Ukraine, anything specific about Ukraine or the famine. And I think that was because of the famine's relationship to this question of Ukrainian nationalism, or the Ukrainian national movement. And this was something that the Soviet communists remained afraid of until the very end. And they were always afraid that it would challenge them, that it would give them problems, and even that it would challenge the Soviet Union itself. And I have to say, when you look at what happened in 1991, they had a point in that it was the Ukrainian national movement and it was the restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty that was probably the most important factor in bringing about the end of the Soviet Union.
So Stalin wasn't crazy for fearing Ukrainian nationalism?
In that sense, no. The Ukrainian national movement was something that was opposed to the Soviet regime from the very beginning, from 1917 until 1991.
What role do you think the Holodomor plays in today's Ukrainian politics, culture, etc.?
The Holodomor is actually, it's a very interesting question. It's played sort of different roles over time. It's one episode in Ukrainian history that unifies the country. It also plays a special role because it was denied. So it's something that everybody knew about. Ukrainian communists knew about it. Everybody's grandmother remembered it. People come up to me all the time and say, my grandmother was there, my uncle died. This story was in our family for many years. Even people who don't live in Ukraine anymore, even Canadians, Poles, and others who have Ukrainian relatives. So it was something that was known and remembered, but never told. And therefore, when in late 1980s, it became possible to speak about it again, it was a kind of moment of national, look, we can tell the truth again. We can say what was real. We have our own history back. So it's always had a very powerful impact on Ukrainians as a unifier, as something that we all can remember. Other aspects of Ukrainian history are much more divisive. Memories of the war can be quite different depending where you were in the country, east or west Ukraine, and so on. But this is something that is, people remember now as, as something that affected all Ukrainians.
How much of today's hostility between Ukraine and Russia can be laid at the feet of the Holodomor?
I wouldn't exactly lay any of it at the feet of the Holodomor. I would say rather that, the hostility is coming from Russian hostility to the idea of Ukrainian independence. And if you think that the Holodomor represented Stalin's hostility to the idea of Ukrainian independence, then you can see a parallel rather than a causation. I would say rather that Russia has many of the same anxieties about Ukraine today that it did, not that it did, but that the Soviet Union did many decades ago. What was it about Ukraine that was what horrified Putin so much in 2014? It was the sight of all those young people with European flags calling for democracy and assaulting corruption. Well, that's exactly the kind of uprising he is afraid of in Moscow. That was it in a nutshell. And his reaction to it, maybe even his overreaction, his invasion first of Crimea and eastern Ukraine, were a reaction to that sight. In other words, once again, we have a leader in Moscow who is afraid that Ukraine and the independence of Ukraine and a pro-Western Ukraine or a democratic Ukraine, whatever you want to call it, is a personal threat to him. And I think we see rather an echo of the past rather than a causation.
This Ukrainian independence idea is hardly a new thing, right? I mean, they've only been a country for 25 years, but how far back does Ukrainian independence go in that kind of a nationalist movement?
Well, in in that form as a nationalist movement, it goes back to the 19th century, which is when most nationalist movements in Europe begin. Ukrainian identity, or the Ukrainian sense of themselves, is somehow separate from Russia and separate from Poland, actually, because they were part of the Polish Empire for a long time, is of course older.
I mean, conquered by Poland, conquered by Germany, conquered by the Soviet Union, only free in 1991, and even now, I mean, they've lost a third of their country today.
Even now, it's a country that is constantly fighting for sovereignty and independence.
Yeah. Has your book been translated into other languages?
It has.
Into Ukrainian?
It is being translated to Ukrainian right now, and I'm hoping it will be published in May.
How about in Russian?
It has not yet been translated into Russian.
Do you know whether this book is purchasable in Russia?
I don't. I suspect not.
Yeah, that's what I would think too. I mean, I imagine they're not keen on having this flying off the bookshelves of Moscow,
No, which
right?
is a shame, because actually I would like Russians to know this history, because if they did know the history, I think they would understand a little bit better what's going on in Ukraine today and why there's this unification of Ukraine, really, against Russia, which has never happened before in history and which is very unfortunate. You know, these are countries that have a lot in common culturally. There's lots of intermarriage. There's no reason why they should be opponents. They should be trading with one another, and they should be close neighbors. But the actions of the Russian president have led to this reaction, which is, as I said, unfortunate.
You speak Russian.
I speak Russian.
When you speak to Russians in their mother tongue, do they know about this?
Some do and some don't.
There are people today in Russia who still don't think this happened?
Oh, I think they would say most people in Russia don't think it happened. I mean, you know, it's because of the suppression of the story and because of the, you know, the many reasons why it was never publicized and why people didn't think it was important, or they were afraid to talk about it, or you know, they had other things they thought were more important at the time. There are lots of people who don't know about it. Certainly, you know, lots of people in Poland don't know about it. Lots of people here don't know about it. It's not just Russians who don't know about it.
In our last minute here, I want to ask you just a bit of a personal question. I got to the end of the book and I thought to myself, this is an author who loves this country. Am I inferring that correctly? Do you love Ukraine?
So, I can't, love Ukraine is an odd idea for somebody who's not Ukrainian. You know, I don't have any national attachment to Ukraine. I admire the Ukrainian drive for independence. I admire the current drive for democracy. I admire those Ukrainians who embody that set of ideals. I would say that.
I think you just said it better than I said it. Love was the wrong word, but I got the sense that you were kind of in admiration of this, you know, of these people who have really tried to do it their own way for a long time and at every turn kind of get screwed.
So I admire people in any country who are willing to fight for a set of democratic ideals, for people who fight for freedom. And in our countries, we don't really have to do that, at least not most of the time, because you know things have been done for us by previous generations. And when I see Ukrainians do it, and of course it's not all Ukrainians, right, but it's some Ukrainians, I'm very admiring.
Well, if I may say, I'm admiring of this book, which was just fantastic, and I'm not surprised you got the Gelber Prize for it. Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, and Applebaum. Thanks a lot for visiting us at TVO tonight. Appreciate it.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.